This is the Sustainable Goat Podcast.
We look to nature for how we should interrelate to the world. All the answers are within nature if we take the time to listen.
But what we have to find is a reasonable way how to handle plastic.
You know, consumers expect more. They're expecting brands to be more sustainable. They're choosing sustainable brands.
These are the stories and ideas from those that will define a generation. I'm your host, Steve Cassinem, and this is our planet in focus.
So I'm in Melbourne in Australia. I grew up in Melbourne. Then I moved away for around 15 years. I was in the Australian Foreign Service for 10 years. So I lived in Ghana in West Africa, and then I lived in New Caledonia in the Pacific. And I fell in love with New Caledonia as a place to live and decided to stay there. And I left the Foreign Service and went back to the private sector. And yeah, so I lived there for nearly 9 years. And that's where my kids, who are now 17 and almost 15, that's where they spent their childhood. It was a pretty amazing place for kids to grow up.
Yeah.
A little island with 270,000 people. So
yeah, I was going to say, what was appealing about that shift?
I have a PhD in French, and I had lived in France as an exchange student when I was around 16 and had just loved France and French culture. And New Caledonia kind of felt like a crossroads between Australia and Oceania and France, because it's still part of France. So it still feels very French, and the education system and the public service and the medical system and all of those things are as they would be in France, and they speak French. But a lot of New Caledonians spend a lot of time in Australia, and there's a lot of kind of back and forth between the two countries. And then there's a fascinating kind of Melanesian population as well. And so, yeah, it really did feel like a crossroads between the two cultures. And I was only ever like a 4-hour flight from home. So that was a great way to be an expat, as opposed to, for example, when I lived in Ghana, it took more than a day to get home to Australia with, multiple flights. So, yeah, and, my kids grew up bilingual on a Pacific island, running around a lot of the time barefoot on the beach and, with nature and sort of surrounded by a far less commercial environment than you would get in a big city in Australia, and I imagine certainly in the US. So they really grew up without kind of being bombarded with sort of advertising and consumerism, and that they would come back to Australia and think that a mall was the most exciting thing that they'd ever seen, or a cinema, because there was only one on the island at that time. And yeah, it was a lovely place for them to grow up, and I think also gave them a really acute sense of the impact of humans on the natural world. Like when as a kid you've seen a turtle that's died because it's had a drinking straw stuck in its nose. Like that's a pretty big thing to see as, a 5 or 6-year-old, and kind of go, wow, we really have an impact here and we really have to do something about it. And they did a lot in the education system around why we need to keep the island preserved and sustainable. Along with Madagascar, New Caledonia is one of the most biodiverse places in the world. So, and has a World Heritage listed reef and lagoon. And so, yeah, there was a lot of kind of sensitization to those things, and it's given them a really different perspective, I think, from what I had growing up in the suburbs of a large city, which wasn't quite as large as it is now. Like when I grew up in Melbourne, there were less than 3 million people, and when I moved back here, there were over 5 million, and I really noticed the difference.
100%. I mean, I think that the contrast is the interesting part about it. It's that going from one way of life that you grow up in, it's city, it's connected culture, and then you go to a more remote place. And I think the idea of sustainability, I'll say, is probably a bit more commercialized at this point than it has been, but it's deep rooted in the culture of anybody that has to live kind of outside of a city. You kind of have to start thinking circularly and think about the environment that you're going to be in all the time, because you want to be able to run around barefoot. You want to be able to keep that biodiverse area around there. I mean, do you think that your experience and your kids' experience kind of growing up in that natural space, how do you think that actually shaped the worldview? Is it just hey, let's protect this? Or is it actually like almost like a culture shock of coming to a city and seeing it be completely different?
Well, yeah, I mean, when we moved back to Melbourne, the kids asked questions like, what's wrong with the weather? Like, why is it not sunny all the time? And they didn't know how to cross roads at traffic lights, and they didn't understand why there was so much noise and so much traffic and why the air wasn't clear. And the first time we went to a beach here, my son, who would have been about 9 or 10 at the time, said, "What's wrong with the water? Like, why isn't it clear?" So, I think it really gave them a sense of what a pristine natural environment can look like. And we live in the city for access to education and to work, but they would both prefer to live in the country. They both say often that when they're not at school anymore, they will move. And so they don't have to live in the big city with the noise and all that sort of thing. But I think the other thing that was really interesting was that when I moved from the Foreign Service back into the private sector, I actually went to work for a mining company. And there is nothing more invasive in terms of the natural environment than mining, but it's also what holds together the economy in New Caledonia, which has around between a quarter and a third of the world's known nickel deposits. And I was working at a really interesting project that was a joint venture between the local Melanesian population, largely, an international mining company, and was a greenfields project. So it was a brand new mine and metallurgical plant that had been built, and I was there for the start of operations. And I think really seeing the impact, both the positive impact that it had in terms of jobs and creating a livelihood for people and giving them access to training and skills on the one hand, producing what is an essential component of what we will need in terms of renewable energies going forward, but also seeing in very stark terms, the way in which mining damages the landscape. And even with, a life of mine plan that planned to replace every species of tree and animal that was disturbed by having a nursery and by documenting to grow all the seedlings and by documenting all of the species that they found so that they could be protected, rehoused, and then introduced back to the environment once the project, like the life of mine, had finished. It's still a fundamentally invasive process. And so I used to get a lot of grief from my kids about that as a career choice. They were like, why are you working this mine? Mining is a horrible thing. Can't you go and work somewhere that's less upsetting to us and offensive? And I think it's a conundrum, and I've heard the statistic from a number of people that if we're going to meet the needs that we have for essential minerals for renewable energies, we're going to have a 5-fold increase in mining globally by 2050. But when you've actually seen what mines do to the landscape, obviously I'm in Australia and mining is a huge industry here as well. But so that as a sustainability professional, that's kind of a sort of degree of dissonance that you have to kind of live with. So how do you make that more sustainable or less invasive then becomes the question. And how do you make sure that from a social sustainability perspective, that the people whose land you are using and whose resource you are using are benefiting from that to the absolute maximum possible?
I love your story because what I think is fascinating about it is the fact that there is another side to sustainability. You can say renewable energy on this side, but at what cost? And then you could say we want to drive electric vehicles, and then it's at what cost? We want to do this, but at what cost? And so every decision you almost have to make in that chain, there is a cost to the other end. And I think, either people aren't open to kind of seeing it, or they haven't been educated, honestly, on what the other side looks like. Because the battery that powers an electric vehicle, it's mined, and it's trucked out with diesel trucks, and you have a cost side of it, and that is part of the thing. There is a true cost no matter what you do, and part of that decision is how do you make that best navigation as possible. Do you think that there's a scalability problem? Is it a human consumption problem, or is it a technology problem? Which do you think is kind of more the limiting factor?
I actually think we have the answer. We don't necessarily have the will to apply it at the moment. I mean, you can answer those questions about what the long-term cost is if you do proper life cycle analysis from kind of cradle to grave, if you like, of the product. And all the life cycle analysis, for example, I've seen of electric vehicles suggests that if your electricity grid is using renewables, once you start using the vehicle, then over the life, like in the life cycle analysis of the product, the electric vehicle is the better outcome for the environment, despite the kind of front end heavy impact of the production. But life cycle analyses are expensive. They take a long time to do, and not a lot of people are skilled in kind of doing them. And I'm not entirely sure that at this point in time, consumers are prepared to pay the added price that you would have to add to the product in order to do that kind of analysis. And, we need to do it for just about every product that we produce. And certainly in Australia, we're seeing, and definitely in Europe, we're seeing a willingness to pay from the consumer for more sustainable products. But whether that will survive the current, high cost of living, inflation, low wage growth, it's easy to make those decisions when you have discretionary income. It's harder to make them when you don't. It then becomes a bit of a luxury. If you're choosing between sort of just getting from A to B and medicine for your family and food, then, I want to do a life cycle analysis and choose an electric vehicle becomes a harder decision to make.
Yeah. And so, I guess part of it is not only the patient side of it, but is there a certain way to make that process a bit smoother in life cycle analysis to bring that cost down? Because I think that, one of the things that I find interesting, and this is where I think it kind of can lead into Xero a little bit, is this idea of finance actually does play a huge role in being able to make that impact. And so where does that have to shift, change, innovate?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. And it's actually probably why I came to Xero. I was working for another company when I first moved back to Australia, and the opportunity to work at Xero, initially I sort of thought, do I want to work in sustainability and software as a service? Like, do we really actually have that much impact on the environment? And then I started to understand the impact that we could have through our customers. How can we help our customers solve these problems? Because small and medium businesses have even less resources and less intellectual bandwidth, if you like, to devote to these things than large companies do. And so I think what's really exciting is the emergence that we're starting to see of new technology that works with Xero. So uses the data that we hold in our general ledger for our clients around the transactions that they do, and allows them to apply life cycle analysis or calculate their carbon emissions on the basis of that finance data that is categorized in Xero using AI. So Xero knows when your electricity bill comes in that it's an electricity bill because you've paid it a couple of times before. So it recognizes it, it tags it. And then we have a number of apps in our broader app ecosystem that allow our customers to plug that app in and use that data that we have within Xero to calculate their carbon footprint, to analyze the full life cycle of their products, to offset the carbon, and also to consider strategies for how to reduce them. So, for example, to do a calculation around whether if they're running a vehicle fleet, it would actually be a lower carbon option for them to switch to an electric vehicle fleet than whatever fleet they're using at the moment. Unfortunately, none of those apps are available in the US at the moment. I
was going to say, this is great.
I just spent some time having a look at that this morning because I thought I'd love to be able to tell you which ones there are in the US. We have them in pretty much all our markets except the US. So anyone who's listening to this podcast, there's an opportunity for you. A number of the partners that we work with in other markets like Australia, New Zealand and the UK, a few that come to mind are one called Kogo that's based in New Zealand and one called Ecology Xero that's based in the UK, are currently looking to expand into the US market with an app that uses the Xero API and allows customers to leverage that data. And we're starting to see people using them more and more in the markets where they're available and getting some really interesting insights into their own business from it. I think that the next step will be, once we have enough people using those kinds of apps, can we produce some kind of benchmark? For example, what is best practice for a media creator and podcaster in terms of a carbon footprint, and what is your performance now versus what best practice looks like, and what are the levers you could pull to improve that outcome. So I think there's a huge amount of opportunity in that space for Xero to really help our customers on that journey. We surveyed our customers and we found that 68% of them want to become more sustainable but don't know where to start. And so we built a small business sustainability hub on our website that has a lot of really practical resources for small businesses to look at, but also education resources for them to understand some of these terms. I probably spend 10 hours a week reading just to stay on top of what's happening in this space. And because it's my job, I fully appreciate that if you're a small business, you can't do that. My partner runs a small business and he's like, explain to me again about the carbon footprint and what I need to do about it. Yeah, because, you're just trying to keep the lights on and pay the bills and make sure your staff get paid and you've got the inventory that you need and you're delivering the service you need. So we're trying to make it simple for small businesses. And that's what excited me about coming to Xero. I came to Xero about 18 months ago, was, the scale at which we can have an impact through our sort of over 3 million small business customers at the moment and growing is just phenomenal. And in fact, 90% of the world's businesses are small businesses. So if we can help those businesses to take small incremental steps to become more sustainable, then we help normalize, a more sustainable way of doing business. And we also help them to understand that it makes good business sense. Like, it's not just something that you do in order to feel good. And I kind of watch with almost disbelief from sitting down here in Australia, the debate that's going on in the US around a kind of outlawing ESG in investment decision making, partly because it's hard to get your head around how you can stop people thinking about things when they make investment decisions. Like, how do you stop someone from considering the environmental impact of a project? But also because I think in Europe and in Australia and New Zealand, we've moved well beyond that. It's part of BAU. You have to think about those impacts, because essentially sustainability is really about how do you future-proof your business? How do you make your business model run in such a way that it's still going to be around no matter what happens in terms of the changing climate, where you're not exposed to massive reputational risk because you're exploiting people in your supply chains, and where you're not exposed to the impacts of extreme weather from climate change that you can't manage and you haven't thought about. And I've really seen boards at a corporate level switch their thinking to, this is actually a fiduciary risk that we have to manage as a business. And one of the things that we're really conscious of, because we work so closely with small businesses, is increasingly, and I don't know whether this will happen in the US, but increasingly we see in Europe, in Australia and New Zealand, that large businesses are imposing those requirements on businesses with whom they do business in their supply chain. So if you want to do business with us, you've got to show us that you don't have child labour in your supply chain, you don't have human trafficking in your supply chain, that you have set emissions reduction targets and you are working to reduce your carbon footprint. And at the same time as we have to do that in order to, we and every other large corporate has to do it to comply with what is currently in many places voluntary standards, but is rapidly becoming mandatory standards. And we see that it's already mandatory in most of Europe, and it will be, we expect, mandatory in Australia and New Zealand within the next 18 months. So then part of the question that I'm trying to help Xero solve is, how do we make sure that small businesses don't get locked out of corporate supply chains by these compliance requirements? How can we help small businesses to surface their environmental and social performance in a way that is simple, not time-consuming, and leverages the data that we already hold about them in Xero? And we don't have all the answers, but there's some really exciting developments happening in that space, and lots of creative people out there building apps to try and solve those kinds of problems.
Man, you hit so many incredible just topics in that block of discussing like the whole really structure of finance and the impact that you can have. I mean, for one thing, from a number standpoint, I mean, yeah, as a business owner, you always want to see the overhead levels of what it is. But the idea that it can be good business and is good business, that's the really important thing. And I think a lot of people forget that, if you can take your own waste and convert that into energy and run your building operations off of that waste, then, well, yeah, you're saving a waste stream, you're saving an energy stream, and you're keeping yourself more sustainable to anything that could happen along your supply chain. And I think by thinking only around renewable energy or recycled materials, that's one piece of sustainability. That's not the actual entire picture. And that's one thing I find fascinating about Xero's. I mean, I've been using it probably for 8 years now at this point or something like that. Just super long time. And what I found is that you have all these numbers at your disposal. Xero's really, really strong at reports. And I think that we have so much information now. We have AI being able to leverage data reconciliation, being able to read through numbers. And I feel like now, as a consumer, as a business owner, or as a corporation, we're now at the age of discernment where we have to be able to read the numbers, because there's no shortage of availability of numbers. I mean, we even at Goat, as a media company, we were trying to solve the issue of supply chain sustainability. Could you do it with blockchain and AI at the time? And you would reach a point in the supply chain where it's either way too expensive, somebody didn't want to spend the time, or their country didn't have regulation around that. And you reach this wall where you can't really get a full picture. The world is starting to move that direction. And as a media company, that's what we've also explored too, is how do we measure the best way to create media? Well, probably one of the biggest impacts of media is actually the travel experience of traveling, shooting, capturing, going with a crew, using the energy on that. That's the majority of our impact, but we also don't see what the other side is until we're able to really dive into the numbers. And that's where I think Xero kind of has that advantage. The small business, it's harder for the small business to actually make that pivot and that choice. I mean, obviously you guys want to remove that friction on the Xero side, but is it more of a requirement of the big business or government, you think, to start to kind of say, hey, you guys have to consider these things? Or do you think it's just going to naturally take its course because businesses are going to go, look, we have to survive because we have either more adverse weather events, we have more things that are fluctuating our supply chain. So we're thinking more this way now rather than trying to be proactive about it?
I think there's both push and pull factors. Smart people are realizing that solid green credentials can be a differentiator in a crowded market for their brand. And I stress the solid because there's obviously a lot of greenwashing and green hushing and things that consumers are really waking up to and are dubious about rightly so, some of the claims that have been made in the past. I mean, I have teenagers at home and I'm astonished by the amount of research they do into brands before they buy anything. They really get that whole piece around, I understand that my wallet is powerful in terms of who I can choose to support or not support. I think we've seen on the environmental side in Europe and definitely on the social side in Australia and the UK, where we have mandatory legislation around managing the risk of modern slavery in the supply chain, which I understand is a term that might not be familiar to US listeners, but it's essentially forced labour, child labour, the worst forms of exploitation of labour in supply chains. And what we've seen is that because big businesses have to report on what they're doing to manage it, they're then pushing those requirements down onto the smaller businesses. So governments kind of set the agenda and said, this is unacceptable. We're going to legislate to make it a requirement for big businesses to report on it. And there's a kind of race to the top mechanism where investors and employees are like, well, what are you doing about this issue? And we want to be able to be proud of how our company's managing that risk, which then requires you to put in place a whole range of systems around due diligence in order to understand. And I'm not going to pretend that it's easy. Like you say, you get to a point in your supply chain where it's very difficult to have visibility. And some people in civil society will sort of say, that the legislation hasn't really driven the change that we want to see. And it's because big businesses don't care. And I actually don't think that's true. I mean, I'm part of a large community globally of sustainability professionals. We're all working to try and solve these problems, but these are hard problems to solve. As you said, you come up against these barriers where you're sort of like, there's no more information beyond that point. I can't see my supply chain beyond that point because my suppliers make it difficult for me to trace this back to source. There's some super interesting technology emerging in that space. You mentioned blockchain. There are some other traceability elements that rely on the increasing availability of satellite coverage and GPS that use tracking mechanisms for goods to allow people to start to build that traceability into their supply chains. My personal view is that's going to happen because a combination of legislation and consumers are going to demand it. And eventually it won't be enough for you to just have a nice corporate social responsibility statement on your website that says, we care about our suppliers and we don't use child labour. People are going to want to see, tell me which factory in which country were my trainers made.
I also think you're seeing that a little bit even on big companies' websites. I mean, it's not necessarily just their annual report even of just, hey, here's our annual sustainability report. And a lot of them look exactly the same. They have the same metrics. They have very dry data that isn't necessarily, it could be accurate, may not be, but it's also not diving into the heart of it. Whereas I think, people are craving that actual, okay, where did it go? What was each stage like? Do you think that's fueled by the consumer just wanting to know more or feeling like they need to in order to make a decision? Because sometimes I think about like price being obviously some of the driving factors of somebody making a decision. So if you have an $18 product and a $20 product, not big difference, one of them's more transparent, that one's pretty clear. But when you have like a $500 and $100 difference, do you think that a transparent supply chain can make that difference? Or is that more on the consumer side to kind of say, hey, I really do want to make that choice?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, and I think the answer is complex. Like I said before, I think sometimes it's a bit of a luxury. If you and I are having this conversation about the fact that we could make that choice, that's because we're kind of part of the 1% that can. I'm really conscious that there are many, many people for whom they've got to go with the $5 T-shirt from Walmart because they really can't afford to clothe their child any other way, and there's no judgment in that. I think the pressure has to come in some ways from legislators requiring the large corporations to do better. The California Transparency and Supply Chain Act, we've just seen new legislation in Canada around prohibiting the importation and sale of goods made with child and forced labour. As those things start to impact the larger corporations, we see them start to lift their game because they have to. And sustainability professionals are probably the only people in the world who think that new legislation requiring businesses to do things is a good thing. And it's always about finding the right balance, because implementing those things is costly and time consuming and difficult. So you don't want an onerous system that then means that everything is priced so high that nobody can actually afford it, or businesses can't continue to do business and do what they're there for. You don't want to operate under a regime that kind of says you can't travel unless you can tell me where the jet fuel came from.
Well, and are you able to, see in the numbers? So for example, even the jet fuel side, Delta has come under fire just for basically saying, hey, are you guys as green as you say you're being in this process? And part of it uncovers not necessarily with Delta, but just this idea that you could theoretically pay a farmer to not tear up the trees that they weren't going to tear up in the first place and write it off as carbon offset. So in that kind of gray part of the industry that is just the Wild West right now, doesn't that leave the consumer just like totally confused as to whether to believe it or not? And I guess more my question in that is that where the numbers that Xero can see on the books, is that where the extrapolated data can actually show if there's actual impact?
I think that's where we'll get to. I'm not sure we're quite there yet. I think offsetting carbon is an interim solution, and increasingly any sensible person that works in this space is recognising that. My view, and Xero's view, and we've been very public about this, is that we do offset all of the emissions that we produce with high quality carbon offset projects, which sometimes do involve, for example, paying people not to rip up virgin forest and doing land rehabilitation. That's not a long-term solution, but it's better than doing nothing while we transition to the long-term solution. So, our stated goal is to get to net zero by 2050, which means fewer than 10% of our actual emissions in hard-to-abate sectors would be offset and the rest would be eliminated. And that's about working with large suppliers to give them incentives to make their own production and services that they provide greener in the longer term. And so I think you're right, it is confusing for consumers. I also understand that the average consumer doesn't spend the amount of time that, for example, I spent doing research on a product before I make a decision to buy it or not.
Do you scroll to the bottom too, right when you land on a site, and go straight to the sustainability and dive in first?
Yeah, like the About Us sustainability, and yeah. I'm like, oh, that's a nice dress. I wonder where it's made. And if they can't tell me the answer to that question, I won't buy it. But the average person who makes a decision to fly from LA to Sydney makes that decision based on price, not based on anything else. And if there's a little button that says they can offset their carbon, they'll go, oh, yeah, that's probably a good thing to do. I'm conscious flying is really bad for the environment, so I should probably offset my carbon. Yeah, I'm prepared to pay $20 extra for a carbon offset on this ticket. Am I prepared to pay 3 times the price in order to travel using sustainable aviation fuel? Probably not. And so I think that's where policy settings become really important. And we've seen in a number of European jurisdictions and the UK that governments have made really deliberate policy settings to subsidise the development of sustainable aviation fuel, to kind of push that into the market and to say, we will make it economical for you to introduce sustainable aviation fuel into the mix to reduce the overall carbon impact of travel, because we understand that leaving it to the free market at this point is not going to solve the problem. That's potentially heresy, saying that to an American. in terms of free market economics, that you do need some market intervention mechanisms to facilitate that transition. And I think to come back to the guts of your question around the data that we hold in Xero, I think what we will be able to help our customers see is how they're performing relative to other people who provide the same goods and services. And are you just in a really hard to abate industry where you do rely a lot on things like air travel? Or are there other ways that you could be doing business that could help you to both reduce cost and reduce your overall environmental and social impact? And look, I was at a conference recently, and I'm not going to do a free plug for a large streaming company, but a large streaming company based in the United States presented some really interesting work that they'd done around reducing the impact of filming and shooting by replacing, all of their diesel and petrol generators with solar-powered generators, by having vegan and vegetarian catering on their food sets, by moving to electric vehicles rather than, the big heavy diesel trailers that kind of transport the actors. And they're making multi-billion-dollar productions.
Oh, they're huge.
And they kind of came to the conclusion that, well, there's not a lot we can do about air travel right now. And that's a really hard to abate sector. So we're going to offset that. And what we are going to do instead is pull all the other levers that we have to make the rest of our output as environmentally sort of friendly, as, if you like, as possible, and reduce the carbon impact there, so that while we work on longer term solutions around something like aviation, we know that we're doing everything that we can. And I think that's probably where we're going to land for some of our small business customers, where we sort of can help them to use the data in Xero to understand, okay, what are the different sources of your emissions? How are they made up? Which are the ones which are relatively easy for you to take action on now? If you're in a leased building where you can't put solar panels on the roof, are there energy suppliers in your area that can help you to transition to using renewables for your electricity? Are there ways in which your product and packaging could be better integrated into the circular economy, so that you're creating less waste and fewer emissions and reusing more? And that will, as you said earlier, that in the end improves your bottom line, because waste is not cost neutral. Like, it always costs your business something. There's always a part of what you're producing or the energy that you've put into developing, selling, marketing, shipping the product that you're throwing away. So if you can get rid of that, then that's good for business as well. And that's where I think not only Xero, but also the advisors that we work with have a really important role to play. So we're really seeing a huge increase in accountants and bookkeepers, who we call our advisory partners, working with small businesses to help them quantify the impact of making those transition decisions to greener or more socially sustainable, or both, solutions, by using some of the analytical capability within Xero. And in many of our markets, using those apps that don't exist in the US. But I really hope that someone will listen to your podcast and correct me on that and say, no, we do have an app and we want to connect with Xero. Like, I'm sure they're out there. We just haven't connected with them yet, because there's plenty of smart people thinking about these, how to solve this problem.
Well, absolutely. And I think a lot of the conversation, we've had people on the podcast that do commercial retrofit of buildings that are mid-sized commercial real estate. And it's like, there's a profitability standpoint of 5 years. The investment that you made is now profit, not even zero. And it's a more sustainable solution. And so it's like, how do you just start to refine that timeline too? So for somebody who's actually going to be able to make a decision to say, I'm going to do this versus that right now, and then next year I'm going to do this, what's the timeline to quote unquote profitability, but more so where it doesn't feel like an added thing? Because I think a lot of people think that I have to hire extra staff, I have to take all this extra time, I have to do X, Y, and Z. And it's like, no, realistically, it's just a subtle change in how, not a complete shift. And that actually can have a lot of a long-term benefit for the company. So that's kind of the way I've thought about it mostly.
I think you're absolutely right. And that's where we're starting to see accounting and bookkeeping partners really stepping up to the plate and thinking it's an additional revenue stream for them. They can provide kind of, if you like, sustainability or carbon accounting services and advisory services to their clients. They can leverage the data in Xero to show their clients through modelling what the payback period is for those kinds of investments, what the upfront cost is, what they're likely to save on a kind of ongoing basis. As you say, in some cases, the investment might take 5 years to pay for itself, but then it becomes actually positive, because you're no longer paying for energy or whatever the case may be. You're no longer paying for packaging, or you've managed to get someone to pay to buy your used product and upcycle it, and that's created an additional revenue stream. And that's where we see our accounting and bookkeeping partners playing a really critical role in helping small businesses, because they do have time to think about that, and they do have time to go through the data that's in Xero and build those sort of financial models. And we're increasingly seeing them offering that as a value-add service to their clients, saying, have you ever thought about this? You're a media production company. Can I have an hour of your time to tell you how I could make your business more profitable by driving some sustainability initiatives that, as you say, don't need you to hire another person, that don't need you to go into a whole lot of technical training in sustainability. But here are some options that exist that you could invest in, and this is what the kind of payback period looks like, and this is what it'll do to your bottom line. Because, the reality is that as much as we might care about these issues, if we can't make them make good business sense for people, it won't happen.
Yep, I agree. I think that's one of the things that we try and focus on, is the fact that it also does have to make sense, because otherwise the rest of the world, the rest of the market, the rest of people, it's a much steeper hill to climb in order to get to the other side. And more so, actually, and I don't know if you know the answer to this question, but for Xero specifically, so software is one of the fascinating areas where energy usage is actually a big topic of conversation, but most people never hear about energy usage in software because they're like, well, it's on the internet, so it's just kind of up there. But they don't realize that, Facebook has server farms in Iceland in order to keep it as cold as possible. What is kind of that impact of software on the planet? And more so, how does that apply more so to Xero specifically?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, and increasingly people are asking that question. What is, particularly software as a service that's all cloud hosted and cloud computing, what is the impact of that, and is that actually worse than getting on a plane? We don't have our own server farms. We outsource data storage, and we have two main partners that we work with. The biggest one is AWS, so Amazon Web Services, who themselves have very ambitious climate commitments, and we are working with them to deliver significant reductions in the footprint of cloud hosting on our overall emissions profile. We saw, for example, in our last financial year, a 65% reduction in the carbon footprint of our cloud hosting, and that's simply by those facilities transitioning predominantly to renewable energies. So then you've got the whole question about the life cycle analysis of those renewable energies. But as an immediate solution, it's better than not doing anything. And we do know that it's still, software as a service is still more energy efficient than having everybody running large computers themselves in their homes, that hold all the data on a hard drive. I'm old enough to remember when computers were a large box that sat underneath the desk because they were too heavy to get onto the desk. So there's no perfect solution to any of these questions. But I think increasingly investors are asking us those questions, and there's a tension from, I would say, our people is probably our biggest driver. We, as a software company, have a pretty young workforce. They're pretty switched on about these issues. They're very purpose-driven. Xero is a very purpose-driven organization. And they really hold our feet to the fire on those questions and say, what are we doing? How are we going to make our coding less energy intensive? What are the ways in which we can optimize which of the different outsourced servers we're going to hold our data on? And can we see the carbon footprint of, if I build this product on this stack that is supported by these servers, what does that carbon footprint look like? And can we optimize it by moving it to being supported by a different server farm in a different country that is running on renewable energy? Our engineers and software developers ask us those questions, and that's a live conversation that's happening within the organization. And I think it's great that our people are so engaged on those questions and that they push us to do better all the time.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is really going to be driven by that decision-making process and that inherent need from not only this current generation kind of coming into that management side of companies, but also the next generation to kind of say, hey, this is what we want in a company. Because I think sometimes the thought process is, well, you're an employee at a company. but you're also an employee at a company. It means that you can drive that change from the inside, and it's kind of up to the company to kind of start to listen. Thankfully, Xero does that. But yeah, I think that progressive nature of a company is also what's going to push it forward, because right now, I don't really see a lot of other solutions on the market besides Xero's. If you wanted to actually do your bookkeeping, do your accounting, and be able to make sure you're keeping track of everything holistically, there aren't really solutions that do that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's always a sense that with providing the product comes a responsibility to do it as sustainably as we can. Like every business and every sector, we don't have all of the answers, but I guess I can assure your listeners that we're actively looking for them. I think one of the most exciting things about working in sustainability in 2023 is that we're trying to solve really hard problems and there's no playbook for them. And that's why working with other companies who we might traditionally see as our competitors is really important. I talk to a lot of other software as a service and software companies and technology companies generally around the world about, what are you doing to solve this problem? How are you approaching this question of server farms or energy or travel? We all have very similar emissions profiles. What are you doing? Like, how are you getting on top of your supply chain issues and understanding where your hardware comes from and who makes it? And we're increasingly seeing kind of alliances of large companies in those spaces who have realized that there's mutual benefit. Like, we've all got the same suppliers and we've got a louder voice when we speak together to be able to say to them, hey, you've got to do something about this, or else we're not going to keep using you because there are other options in the market that are performing better. And so I think that's what's really interesting and exciting about working in this space at the moment. And I know progress is often slower than people who are outside of the space would like. My kids hold my feet to the fire on that one too. Why haven't you fixed this yet? It's like, well, because it's actually
a lot of steps.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard, and I understand the urgency. Obviously, this is the space I work in. I know what the UN and the IPCC reports are saying. We're running out of time, and we have to fix this problem quickly. So we are working with urgency, but not all of the problems that we're trying to solve have simple and straightforward solutions. So I guess what I'm saying is, where we can make an impact, let's do that, and let's do that quickly.
That's one of the things that we've measured as a media company. I mean, that's one of our three pillars really are intentionality, circularity, and community, because with those three things, you need to have the intention around what you're going to solve. And you need the community of other businesses. You're finding that, businesses that are competition, we've noticed this actually across the board. Businesses that are in the exact same sector, direct competition, they're like, hey, let's team up because we got to solve this. Because that's the way to progress. And so we're finding that if you think circularly with intention, with a community, you can actually start to drive that change. And that's been the biggest thing that we've noticed across the board that's leading to more progress than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think those pillars sound like exactly what I would kind of draw as the picture of what we all need to do in order to solve these really hard problems. And I think we will, well, I hope, I'm not sure, maybe I hope more than I think, but we will eventually get to a point of critical mass where if you're not doing it, you're the outlier. And so you've got to kind of come into the fold. Just like, we've seen with questions around sort of worker exploitation in supply chains, because some of the really large brands took a lot of heat for it 15, 20 years ago, actually many of them are now leading in that space because they realized that they had to fix that problem because it was bad for their brand, it was bad for their reputation. And I guess I'm a bit pragmatic in this space in the sense that I don't really care why people do the right thing as long as they do it.
Yeah.
People sort of say, oh, but it's just a brand protection exercise. I'm like, if protecting your brand is what drives you to do the right thing and implement the change that needs to happen to make your supply chain more sustainable environmentally and socially, then do it. Large corporates are not NGOs. We're not charities. We're here to make money and keep people employed and do what we do, as well as serving our sort of higher purpose as an organisation, which in our case is to help small businesses and their communities and the people who advise them to thrive and make life better for them. But you have to be clear-eyed about the fact that you're still operating in a commercial environment, so everyone still wants to make money.
Yeah, and especially if you're a big company, I mean, and especially a public company, you have a responsibility to the shareholders.
Yeah.
And that purely is what drives a lot of that decision making, but it also shows that the market can dictate what eventually that company does, the shareholders. And also, I think a lot of people forget that the bigger the ship, the longer it takes to turn. So there could be policy, people doing stuff on the inside that, maybe the public doesn't see yet. It's just the ship's taking a long time to turn because it takes a long time to turn.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we have a real commitment to at Xero in terms of our work on our own sustainability as a company is to doing things properly. By which I mean, it took us a while to get our emissions targets out there, and we were under quite a lot of pressure from our investors and shareholders and people like, why don't we have carbon reduction targets? It's like, because we're not just going to put a number out there without having a reasonable basis on which to think that we can deliver on it and that we can achieve it. So we need to do the work first to understand, what's driving our emissions and what do the reduction pathways look like, and what do we think that we have a reasonable basis for believing we can deliver. And similarly, in other parts of our work, we've held ourselves to a very high standard in line with our values, that we're not going to take necessarily the cheapest, fastest option. We're going to take the one that has integrity and shows that we're doing things in the best way we possibly can with the information and resources that we have available sort of right now, which is the only way you can ever really make a decision, right? You don't have a crystal ball. A better solution might come along. So yeah, and I think what we say to our small business customers who are like, I don't know where to start. I don't know what to do about sustainability. It just feels like something that people want from me, but it feels hard and it feels expensive, and I feel like I don't have any time to devote to it. And I suppose our response to that is twofold. One is, well, use Xero and we'll free up some of the time that you spend on doing things like paying your people and reconciling your bank statements. And that way you have more time for running your business and for strategic thinking. And second, just start. Start somewhere, start small. Start by looking at what the data that you hold in Xero tells you about where you can have the biggest impact. Because it's not the same for every company. Depending on what sector you're in, depending on the vertical, where you have a lever to make a difference is going to be quite different if you're driving a fleet of buses and if you're producing media or if you're a florist. So thinking about where is my footprint, either social or environmental, most significant, and then what does the data that I have from Xero tell me about how I could reduce that, how I could spend that money in ways that might make more of a positive impact and less of a negative impact, and then what would the impact to my bottom line be of doing that?
Yeah. And what's your favorite part of what you do day to day, your process, your position you're in at Xero? What's kind of your favorite part of trying to solve this puzzle? Because it really is almost like a 3-dimensional or even 4-dimensional puzzle that you're constantly trying to solve every day.
Yeah, look, I think I have two favorite parts. One is that I just love the innovation that I see from our customers and our broader ecosystem. Like, I'm just constantly blown away by these people who start these amazing for-purpose businesses or who come up with these great ideas. We could do this differently. Or someone comes and pitches an app and says, no, I've got an app now that can tell you, or I've got some tech now that can tell you, where your goods in your supply chain originated from the point of production to the point of sale. And I'm just like, wow, these people, like, the creativity and innovation that is going on in the space, and people who see opportunities to leverage the data that we have in Xero to make those opportunities more powerful and amplify the impact is just one of the things that I love and that I'm constantly amazed by. And I'm like, great minds out there trying to solve this problem, and I love this. I think in terms of the internal work, what's really rewarding is, by internal, I mean, trying to move the ship that is Xero, which is, a medium-sized ship. We're a corporate, but we're not the Titanic. I've worked for a couple of organizations that were, and they do take longer to turn around. But I think when you start to be able to have a conversation with leaders within your business, where you can get them to see that you're not the bunch of hippie greenies that sits in a corner that is a handbrake on the organization, that you're actually all driving for the same outcome, and that it makes better business sense to do the things that we're asking them to do. And let me help you achieve your goals, your KPIs, your outcomes that you're trying to achieve as a business. And let me show you how being more sustainable or offering products in that space can actually help you get there faster. And that's kind of a light bulb moment that you see, where you switch from people being, oh, who is this annoying person who keeps wanting to talk to me about planting trees, to actually, no, we're embedded in the commercial part and thinking of the organization, and we're driving towards the same goals. And that's really satisfying when you get that, when that light bulb moment happens and it's like, oh, okay, right. Because I think there is a bit of a tendency to think that the people who work in the sustainability space are not commercial and don't understand the commercial imperatives of business. And one of the things I do with my team a lot is when they sort of have ideas or ways of approaching things is say to them, put the business's hat on here. How do we help the business meet its goals by doing this? And going and pitching to someone, we should do this because it's the right thing to do, is just not going to work. So yeah.
Never does.
It never does. So you got to find the business case and find the way of getting people interested, because there are broader benefits to the business of kind of getting on this bus and coming on this ride.
Do you find yourself trying to find a way to get back to an island in the future from Melbourne?
What, to live? Yeah.
Yeah.
At some point. I mean, I do live on an island. It's just a really, really big one.
Yeah, it's a really big one.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think when I don't have teenagers who need access to school and services and things like that, I probably wouldn't choose to live full-time in the middle of a big city. Although it does have its advantages in terms of kind of cultural life and, other richnesses. I guess the one thing that I would say is that sometimes people look at what I believe is these days now called a portfolio career and say, you've done such a weird mix of things. But in fact, when you're in the Foreign Service and you're a diplomat, what you spend most of your time doing is trying to influence people to see your point of view on things. And I essentially still do exactly the same job. I just do it inside organisations instead of for a foreign government. It's all about, here's why you should think like we do about this.
Yeah. Well, and I think that what's fascinating about that side is it's a psychology, it's a compromise, it's a connection with another human being. I think a lot of people forget that solving a lot of these problems, yes, there's business mechanisms, yes, there's inanimate objects involved, whether it's a server or a computer or a product, whatever it is. But at the root of it, it's very human. And I think that people forget how to connect as humans. That is the way that I think things go forward too, is to be willing to see someone else's perspective, appreciate that perspective, agree or disagree, doesn't much matter, and move forward to a collective solution that I think everybody's in favor of. I think we would all love to see our oceans super clear. I think everybody would like to see our forests be beautiful and still there. Nobody really goes, oh, you know what? No, I hate that. But it's the how to get there, I think, is where everybody gets caught in it. I think rooting it back to just being human, I think, is one of the greatest challenges, but also the biggest assets that we have.
For sure. And we see that absolutely among our own people. It's actually far easier to get people to think about what they're doing by telling them that their choice is going to have a positive impact on the planet or forests or oceans than by saying to them, you should do this because it reduces cost, because it will reduce cost. Like, you can have the same argument about, like, do you need to get on that plane and travel to that place, or do you need to make that purchase from that organization? And depending on, if you like, the kind of motivation that you go for, you have really different conversations and really different levels of engagement. And I think you're absolutely right. As humans, if you put it to people that actually this is what the end outcome will look like if you make that choice, then we all want the same thing. It's just that many people are not prepared to, if you see, this is a tricky expression to use, but I guess it's what we have to say, are not prepared to kind of give up certain conveniences because that feels like too much of a stretch. And so I guess you can either be really hardcore and you can say, okay, we all have to not have technology and live like Luddites and all go back to living in the forest and being completely self-sustainable off-grid and all of those things, which is laudable for people who manage to do it. Good on them. And that's great. But then for the other people who are not going to do that, how do we make it easy to make those choices? And that's where I think it's a combination of policy settings, investor pressure, employee pressure, consumer pressure, like all of those things are leading in the same way. And eventually we will get to a point where it's easier to make the right choices, I believe. Will we get there faster? I don't know.
Well, and where's your favorite place to enjoy nature on the planet?
My team will laugh when they hear this podcast because I'm notorious for being a bit allergic to nature in the sense that I really am a city person and I am not someone who would ever go like for a hike or go and camp or go into a forest. Like that's not my thing. But I love the beach and I love the ocean and I've grown up on this big island. I could never live far away from the water. I like that sense of the kind of endless horizon and openness that you get from being on the coast and kind of looking out and thinking, you know, somewhere like hundreds of thousands of people are living thousands of kilometers away from me on the other side of this vast ocean. But in the middle, there's all this kind of emptiness, if you like, this space that I think really for me helps me like think and reconnect and remember why I do this and why it matters. But yeah, I'm definitely not the typical sustainability professional who goes camping every weekend. And my team tease me about it all the time. But there is a reason for that, and I feel I need to say this. I have grown up in Australia where we have a lot of stuff that can kill you.
Yes. No, that is honestly like the size of the things, the type of things. It's like, no, I totally understand that.
We have like something like 8 of the 10 most venomous snakes in the world and most of the most venomous spiders. And I'm like, yeah, there's just kind of a lot of stuff out there that could kill me if I was wandering around in nature. So I did enjoy it when I was in New Caledonia because I didn't have to worry about those kind of things. Apparently I should move to New Zealand because they don't have snakes there.
Really? That's so interesting.
So yeah, maybe I do need to end up on a smaller island with no snakes and then I would be in a better position to enjoy nature. Yeah, it's the stuff that can kill you out there that bothers me a lot.
100%. But you're at least close to the ocean, and that part is definitely what matters for sure.
And there's plenty of stuff there that can kill you as well. So
that is very true. Yeah. Underwater is full of life too. So, well, thank you so much just for taking the time to hop on the podcast, dive into, I mean, everything from finance to Xero to industry to supply chain. I mean, I specifically love your background just because it comes from the idea of mining and making a business out of harvesting stuff from the earth. And I think that contrast and the way you've lived your life has been fascinating, but also the way you see the solution, I think is exactly down the pathway of thought that I think can kind of lead to progress. So thanks for taking the time. I'm excited to just see where it goes, how it goes, and to see the development of Xero. And hopefully in the US, we get some more measurement tools that we can use and find some actionable steps on and gamify it a little bit.
Yeah, I hope so too. And thanks for the opportunity for the chat. It's been really interesting.
Thank you for listening to the Sustainable Goat podcast. I'm your host, Steve Castanem. With each episode, we can further define what it means to create a truly sustainable and resilient future.
I think the new status is to show that you actually care. You want to drive change and you want to be part of a sustainable future.
People fight for what they love.
Let's really all target for a small but significant shift in the way we live, we consume, and we plan our life.
Join us at sustainablegoat.com.